Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and today we're going to take a break from our series that looks at the various roles of Star Wars vehicles and answer a question sent by one of you guys. His name is Lego Guy, and he asked us, what is the difference between the Stormtrooper Corps and Imperial Army? Great question. Well, to begin with, the Stormtrooper Corps is actually a part of the Imperial Army. A lot of people think of the Stormtroopers as more like the Marines and assume that they are a part of the Imperial Navy, but they aren't. The Imperial Navy actually has their own ship security that sometimes also serves as away teams. They're called Navy Troopers. They generally wear those really large, oversized helmets. So now we have the Imperial Army Troopers, and then you have the Stormtrooper Corps, which is a sub-unit of the Imperial Army. In a way, I guess they could be compared to the US Marines because they are primarily an infantry unit. The Stormtroopers are the direct descendants of the elite clone troopers in the Grand Army of the Republic. As a matter of fact, the first Stormtroopers were just clones wearing new armor. As the clone trooper program ran its course and was eventually shut down for security and cost reasons, human citizens of the Empire began replacing clones in the Imperial military. Generally speaking, the Empire was very anti-alien, so you didn't have any aliens serving in the Imperial military, especially in the Stormtrooper Corps. And also, they discouraged women from joining the Stormtrooper Corps, and some women just couldn't really meet the physical standards either. This actually meant that the few women Stormtroopers that made it through training were tough as nails. Now, as a heavily militarized society, the Empire started training their officers at quite a young age. Most regional academies, equivalent to maybe elementary or middle school here on Earth, began testing their local citizens in an effort to separate the smartest and most capable cadets for placement in special Imperial Academy schools. The higher one tested, the more likely they would be accepted in one of the more prestigious academies across the galaxy, like the Royal Imperial Academy on Coruscant or the Arcanus Academy. Placement in a good academy generally guaranteed a bright future within either the Imperial Navy or Army, which for most citizens in the Empire was their best employment opportunity and quickest pathway to success. While most cadets tried to become fleet officers or pilots within the Imperial Navy, those who were very physically capable and scored high in their loyalty rating were oftentimes sent to specialized infantry school like Academy of Carida, which was located on a high-gravity planet to make training tougher. Academies such as this one focused primarily on creating infantry officers and Stormtrooper infantry officers. In these academies, cadets were constantly being broken down physically with exercise, drills, and combat sims. But they were also being programmed to be loyal servants, not only to the Empire, but directly to the Emperor himself. While technically speaking, the Stormtrooper Command reported directly to the High Imperial Command, Darth Vader and the Emperor could override any directive. This is one of the major differences between the Imperial Troopers and the Stormtrooper Corps. The Stormtrooper Corps was almost like an elite political military force. Not all that different from the Republican Guard, who were fanatic Baathists that were separated from the main Iraqi army and served Saddam Hussein directly. Like the Iraqi Republican Guard when they were defeated, many of the more hardline Stormtroopers would throw away their uniforms and armor and continue fighting as insurgents in an asymmetrical war against the New Republic. As a matter of fact, the New Republic intelligence officers in charge of Imperial prisoner processing centers would always watch out for Stormtroopers because they always tried to blend in with the general prisoner population and then would blow themselves up because they saw Imperials who were surrendering as traitors. And while Stormtrooper training helped create fanatic soldiers, a lot of individuals were also purposely selected because of their personality types. Recruiters oftentimes look for specific psychological profiles, including extreme mental toughness and, in some cases, just a lack of empathy. Stormtrooper officers were taught from day one that casualties were acceptable, and officers were trained to disregard their wounded comrades until the firefight or mission objective was completed. The Stormtrooper cadets were further dehumanized when they were given operating numbers in place of their names. This is similar to what happened to the clone troopers. And that was the whole idea. The Empire wanted robotic-like soldiers who were focused only on accomplishing missions. A lot of the cadets in the Stormtrooper program would eventually wash out and join the Imperial Navy and Imperial Army. And while these individuals were seen as failures by the Stormtrooper Corps, they are usually very welcome in other branches of the military given their elite training. Only a small percentage of Imperial soldiers made it through the academies, and usually they ended up being officers. The majority of Imperial soldiers went to Imperial recruiters or were conscripted. Imperial recruiters could be found on almost every world in the galaxy. These recruiters weren't all that different from the ones we have here on Earth, although on economically depressed or isolated planets, especially in the Outer Rim, oftentimes joining the military was the only option a lot of Imperial citizens had. While individuals who graduated from an Imperial Academy usually went to specialized officers' schools afterwards, most of the citizens who went to Imperial recruiters would go straight to boot camp and then be deployed as enlisted soldiers. But if an individual tested well in their aptitude tests, they could also be sent to an Imperial Academy. Han Solo, for instance, was able to make it to an Imperial Flight Academy after enlisting due to his excellent piloting abilities. But he crashed one too many starfighters and was eventually kicked out. For everyone else, Imperial Academy drop camp was usually their next destination after a quick medical and intelligence assessment. In these camps, recruits were exposed to the same type of training that Stormtroopers usually went under, but for a shorter period of time and with less intensity. Some drop schools were located in more exotic locations with extreme weather or fauna to produce more specialized troops. Although Imperial Army troopers were also indoctrinated, this indoctrination was not as heavily pushed as it was in the Stormtrooper Corps. A rogue like Han Solo might be able to make it in the Imperial Army, but he would have immediately been kicked out of the Stormtrooper Corps for his lack of obedience. A good percentage of the Imperial Army was also made up of conscripted soldiers, usually from local planetary defense forces that were absorbed by the Empire after the Clone Wars. It's not to say that the Imperial Army was not well trained. You had some really elite Imperial Army units as well that could easily go toe-to-toe with the Stormtrooper Corps, but there is definitely a more relaxed culture in these units, especially when compared to how intense the Stormtroopers were monitored. Their helmets were constantly recording what they were doing on every mission. When it came to military duty, Stormtroopers and Imperial Army troopers had many overlapping responsibilities. Both organizations were oftentimes stationed on large Imperial capital ships as Marines, and also were garrisoned at Imperial military bases. But generally speaking, Stormtroopers usually saw more combat. This was because they were designed primarily as assault infantry. This is why Stormtroopers have full body armor and completely closed off helmets compared to the much less heavily armored Imperial Army troopers. Stormtroopers were also especially trained for shipboarding operations and also attacking heavily fortified positions, whereas the Imperial Army trooper units were much larger and usually supported by Imperial Navy assets and mechanized vehicles and artillery. They would also fight with combined armed tactics more often. The Stormtroopers were more like light infantry. Because they usually were the first unit on a battlefield, they were equipped like an expeditionary force. Although they did have their own armor and transportation vehicles, Stormtroopers usually relied on small arms and portable artillery. Sometimes Imperial Army assets such as tanks and walkers, along with Imperial trooper drivers, would be attached to a Stormtrooper expeditionary force if additional firepower was needed, like during the Battle of Hoth. Because most Stormtrooper units were stationed on Imperial Navy assets, their air support also came from the Navy. Because they were a smaller organization and were shock troopers, Stormtroopers were expected to be able to fight in any kind of environment and handle any kind of situation, but they were primarily used to establish beachheads or take particularly well-defended fortifications. Although there were specialized Stormtroopers for extreme environments, these type of specializations were usually more common in Imperial Army troopers. Because usually after the Stormtroopers take an enemy position, the army was called in to hold that position. Imperial Army deployments and missions usually lasted months and in some cases years, so it made more sense to specialize certain units that handle local environments. Stormtroopers generally weren't wasted for more tedious and slow-moving trench warfare or occupation, unless it was an extremely important strategic target. As the Empire continued expanding their military and territory, the amount of Stormtrooper units also increased drastically. But for the most part, the Imperial Army made up the bulk of the Galactic Empire military. The reason why we rarely see these soldiers in holodramas is because they oftentimes weren't assigned to the most glamorous or important duties. While the Battle of Minbum was an extremely costly and devastating conflict that lasted for several years, it wasn't all that important on the galactic scale. The holodramas usually focused on key points in galactic history, and oftentimes it was Stormtroopers that would be stationed at these important locations, like the Death Star or maybe the Kyber crystal mining operation on Jedha. Most anti-rebel operations also used Stormtroopers, who were better tasked with offensive missions and fighting against mobile guerrilla units. It should be noted, however, when it came to special forces, especially ones that went behind enemy lines or went undercover, the ISB and Imperial Army had their own dedicated units. Stormtroopers, while considered elite infantry units, would stick out like a sore thumb amongst the civilian populace. Even without their shiny white armor, you can usually tell an individual is a Stormtrooper by their mannerisms, posture, and even physical appearance. So those are the major differences between the Stormtroopers and the Imperial Army troopers. Although they seemed quite different on paper, their responsibilities did overlap, and oftentimes because the galaxy was so big, whoever was closer to a situation would be called there first. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.